And now, as Josh would say, for something completely different, we have Bratmobile. So, boy, I'll tell you one thing about Bratmobile is it is not the easiest group to figure out like what you'd pick for the montage, because these songs come in
sweet.
And they leave. So going there, but I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in the montage "Fuck Your Fans" is going to be there, and then,
good one.
Love it.
And then right now you're going to hear "Cool Schmool." So go ahead and run those numbers.
Yeah. Potty Mouth by Bratmobile comes in at number 2,963 in the 1990s on Best Ever Albums, number 295 in 1993, number 17,942 of all time. It is Bratmobile's highest rated album on Best Ever Albums. Did not make Rolling Stone's list, and Bratmobile comes in at number 9,107 of overall artist rankings on Best Ever Albums.
So we are officially, this is punk rock obviously, but we are now at the genre of music known as Riot Grrrl, Grrrl. Are you guys familiar with Riot Grrrl historically?
I am somewhat familiar with the genre, yes, John.
Yes, okay. Somewhat also. I don't know the whole historical timeline of it, but I know of bands.
So I'll give you the thumbnail sketch. Riot Grrrl is it's basically like a feminist punk offshoot to traditional like punk music, right? That was looked at as being very, very testosterone filled. So a lot of time it's almost impossible to separate it from sort of the politics of it and the feminism of it, which I think makes probably its closest companion music hardcore, I would say, and it's as much a lifestyle as it is a music. It's got an indie rock thing because it was underground, and it's sort of like taking punk sensibility and throwing it into feminism, and like where do those things go? So like a lot of stuff about rape, sex positive, right, about class system, sort of leftist politics, and a lot of it was sort of in response to punk, like almost like call and response with punk. And then there was sort of subgenres of Riot Grrrl that was called like queercore and stuff at the time. That was if you took it, but you also made it sort of more informed of what we would now call LGBTQ issues. And also it was very much tied into the DIY ethic of punk, but also it had a heavy zine culture. How much do you guys know about zine? I wrote for a zine at one point, guys, when I was 15 years old. Yes, lost to history, as all zines.
Oh, you're like Cameron Crowe, John.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd go that far, but I think anybody with any sort of interest in music like had a zine.
What zine did you write for?
I wrote for a ska zine back in the day that also covered some punk along the way. So you know how it was, like in that era, this was the early days of the internet, so I was not doing the postal zine. You know, this was like a zine where you collect. It sounds crazy to say this, but at the time this was cool, and then within like 2 years it became really uncool, right? But like when the internet first became a thing, believe it or not, like going into like internet relay chats and Usenet boards and even like AOL chat, right? We're still kind of like the great unknown, and they weren't like what they became. And so you'd find all these people and you're like, holy shit, people like what I like, and you get excited and you're like, we can like send stuff to people and we don't have to have like all these stamps and shit. And that was like the era of zine where I'm in. Now these folks are in the zines where it was still very much like you wrote a newsletter and then you sort of distributed it to other people, and they had like kind of shockingly huge reaches in that era because, if there's one thing we know about the pre-internet era, if you had a desire to do something, you somehow managed to find your people after a while. So there's a lot more that goes in, with Riot Grrrl, along the way. Even the spelling of it was there, but Bratmobile is like a first tier Riot Grrrl band, which is going to be interesting because we're going to have some other groups tonight that are going to have some overlap as well. And so
like the Runaways, they're like proto Riot Grrrl then, basically, just due to the time period.
Yeah, pretty much. Like, I mean, they're way ahead. I would say if you want to go proto, you could do like that. The Slits are, I think, a very along with the one that Kurt Cobain loves and we covered, and we all liked the albums. We did 2 of their albums.
The Raincoats.
The Raincoats. There you
Yeah.
go. I apologize. It slipped my mind for a second. Those would be, I think, even more proto Riot
Yeah.
Girl, X-Ray Specs. There were a lot of these things, in the ether in the late 70s. But then remember, like hardcore and stuff hadn't happened, so that
Right.
very much influenced this too. So if you took sort of the spirit of that and mixed it with the entirety of the 80s happening, here you go, Riot Girl. So Bratmobile starts with Allison Wolf, who is from Olympia, Washington originally, which is sort of Riot Girl Central. So if punk is Seattle, Olympia, Washington is Riot Girl Central. And then Molly Newman, who is from DC, which kind of tracks, right? When you think about who came from DC, well, members of Minor Threat came from DC. That's where Henry Rollins came. So like there's always been a little bit of the scaffolding there. So in fall 1989, they're living next door to each other in the dorms at the University of Oregon, which is pretty crazy, right? You know what I mean? That they're just both next to each other. It's like, hey, you have these same things with us. Then like the bio becomes almost like comically like a Mad Libs of like sort of leftist punk music, right? Like you almost have to laugh at this. So the Wolf's parents, so like Allison Wolf's parents, she'd been raised by, how it was described, was a lesbian activist mother, and Newman's father worked for the Democratic National Committee and had introduced his daughter during the course of her childhood to members of the Congressional Black Caucus. And so like it's kind of like, okay, that tracks pretty much. They both took many classes in women's studies and music. It's kind of almost, I hate to say it because it makes total sense, but it's almost like if you were to say, okay, what would somebody who is in Riot Girl do? Like all the things you would say would be the things that they did,
Like
right?
the stereotypes, yeah.
The stereotypes, but also like how you would kind of get there, right? So what ends up happening is they share the same influences, punk. They did like hip hop. I didn't really see hip hop in here, but pep punk for sure.
Yeah.
And they also loved the band Beat Happening, who actually we didn't cover, and I kind of wish we had covered them because they're from Olympia and they're a band that comes up a lot when you're talking about influential 80s bands. They're very minimalist, would be how I would describe Beat Happening. But anyway, they start creating a zine, a fan zine, called Girl Germs in 1990, which had a feminist slant. So as this is happening, a friend, Calvin Johnson, who is an indie musician in the Olympia scene, he was in Beat Happening and another group called the Go Team and owned a record company, K Records. He asks the two of them, Newman and Wolf, to play a show. And there's 2 other groups on the act. One is a group called Some Velvet Sidewalk, and then the other one is Bikini Kill, who is a band that has some famous members, and we're going to cover a little bit later. So I'll step back on that a little bit. I think the people that most people would know from Bikini Kill are their drummer Toby Vale and their singer and songwriter Kathleen Hanna are sort of the 2 people that kind of show up in other groups and probably are the more famous members of it. They kind of, in the spirit of like so many of these punk groups, they like didn't know how to play instruments, right? But they'd had some songs and they just decided to kind of go for it, right? And it somehow all comes together for them. They kind of were told to like listen to the Ramones for inspiration. And so it's like, all right, taking all of those influences they love, the minimalist of Beat Happening with the feminism and sort of the skeletal, all the influences of the Ramones, right? The surf, the Phil Spector pop and stuff like that. They kind of push it together and they create their version of that music. And they're sort of slowly writing songs. First, it starts with 5 original songs. They're playing like local acts. They're messing around with different instruments. They end up on the Kill Rock Stars compilation because like in 1991, that's just what happened. You ended up at these shows regardless of what was happening. They add a bass player. Her name is Michelle Noel. They play some shows with the Melvins at that point, and now we're at like May 16th, 1991. So at first they think of the band as like a collective of musicians, so they didn't necessarily think of themselves as a band. It was just sort of, they're just playing music, kind of like they're not taking it seriously, right? That's just a part of, it's like an extension, a hobby, it kind of seems like in the reading I do. But then they go to Washington, D.C., and they start adding on all these different people into the group. There's a woman named Erin Smith on guitar. There's a woman named Christina Balat on drums and bass. There's a Jen Smith, who's like an artist who's kind of adding, it kind of goes back to the 60s, right? Where they have an artist who's a member of the band as inspiration, stuff like that. And in an interesting one, Matt, they, Aaron Smith, the guitarist, who joins the band, is from Bethesda, Maryland. And they meet and they kind of come together, and pretty much that is where the band starts to congeal as Bratmobile. They're called Bratmobile DC at this point, and it's Newman, Wolf, Aaron Smith, and Christina Balat are there. So they finally, at this point, after all these different changes, are playing different music going around. They create a cassette tape called Bratmobile DC, and finally, as we get to Potty Mouth, they become a trio, and it is just Wolf, Newman, and Aaron Smith, and that is who kind of comes together. So they are touring. There's some famous shows they do in Olympia, in DC. They're on the International Pop Underground Convention. They're kind of like playing on bills with a who's who of the genre. Fugazi is there, but Beat Happening keeps coming up. They're very much a seminal like influence and sort of like inspiration in their own way. They released this album, Potty Mouth, on June 8th, 1993, and the album is recorded at the Embassy in Washington, D.C. I think both you guys might be a little bit familiar with that. Mm-hmm. Yep. The payment for I found this hilarious, the payment for the sound engineer, recorder, Tim Green, who did this, was a slice of cheese pizza and a bottle of black hair dye, which is pretty awesome along the way. These are songs that have kind of been written over the years 1991 and 1992. There also are some songs recorded at other places in Olympia, Washington. And pretty much this is considered to be one of the Mount Rushmore albums in the Riot Grrrl genre. It was pretty well received when it came out. It ends up on a number of best of lists of the 1990s, including Pitchfork and NME. And yeah, we are in a new and reasonably influential genre right here, Riot Grrrl. And this is our first taste of it, really. Matt, let's have you have the first take.
Yeah, totally new to me. Never heard of these guys, or these ladies, I should say. And yeah, I enjoyed it. The Riot Grrrl that I don't know if I say identify with the most or just enjoy the most or know the most is Slater-Kinney. So there's certainly some, you could see some of the influence from here to them. And yeah, I enjoy this. This is very, the overall sound of the record is very stripped down. It sounds like a lot of demos, to be honest. It's just like, it's like garage rock is certainly an influence here. It's a lot of it is kind of 60s and even 50s, like a song like, what is it, Throwaway. There's kind of the guitar.
Surf rock was a big influence.
Okay, so yes, so surf rock too, right? So it's got like there's like a 50s doo-wop, kind of aesthetic to some of these songs as well, which I really like. It's just done in a very minimalist, stripped down nature. It does whatever amplifier they are using for the guitar. They're not throwing on a bunch of effects or different distortion. It's kind of a very straight ahead, basic type of sound that they have, but that's okay. I think there's a lot of cool guitar riffs here. There's a lot of these. First of all, I don't think is there any song on here that less than or over more than 2 minutes. It's
yes, two.
Yeah. Okay.
Throwaway is 2:12. And Cool Schmool is 2:01.
Yeah, so there you go. So everything's like in the minute, And unlike, I know we've covered other albums, I remember this reminded me a little bit of Wire, because that had a lot of tracks as well in a very short, the runtime of this record is under a half hour. It's like 27 minutes, and there's 17 tracks. And I remember thinking with Wire that, it's almost, it was only too many songs. I'm trying to grasp onto too much, and the flow of it I didn't enjoy as much. Even though I did like the record, I don't know. I didn't feel that as much here, and maybe that's because I don't know. Maybe the songs on the Wire album varied more. I don't remember much about that record. I just remember that being a feeling that I had, but I didn't really have that feeling
awesome,
here.
Matt.
Yeah, and I know.
Yeah.
But this one, I don't know. I thought that the length of the songs were perfectly fine. Even if it's Polaroid Baby is only 54 seconds, but it only needs to be 54 seconds. It's this a cappella, kind of get in, get out kind of a song, and so I wasn't thrown off by that really at all. I actually thought that some of this stuff had a little bit of and I did look it up to see if they were an influence, and I didn't see it, but there's a little Joy Division here in terms of the way that the guitar is being played. It's very similar to kind of how some of the songs that Peter Hook did with Joy Division. And you can just listen to the first song, Love Thing. As soon as that started, I was like, there's a little Joy Division happening here as well. So I picked up on that at least. But yeah, the production's very lo-fi. There's a lot of raw energy. There's a lot of angst, female angst, a lot of, dropping the F-bomb and also being subversive somewhat and saying, that she just wants to, bang all these guys and stuff and being unapologetic about it, at least in the, the literal sense of the words and the lyrics that she's saying. But short songs kind of in and out, but it's kind of, I think the album really works for me. I enjoyed it. It's got some great riffs. Some of the vocals seem a little almost put in the background. It's almost like secondary. The guitar's actually out in front sometimes, it seems like, of some of this. So I thought the mix was interesting. But I like stuff like this, like just raw, music is kind of just like, it's almost like they just got together. It's almost like the way they did "Please Please Me." They, with the Beatles, they just did the whole album in one day. This album wouldn't surprise me if they just recorded it all in one shot and just left, right? And only had one take on each song. So yeah, interesting. Really enjoyed it. And thumbs up on my end.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think the Ramones comparison is apt. I feel like when a band or a sound becomes like so DIY and low production, it kind of distills rock and roll and punk rock to its essence, and that's kind of what I feel with this band, and it really works for me. It's like they take away all the unnecessary stuff and like just get to the guitar and like the emotion and anger that rock and roll can have. I really like how kind of angry and sexually frustrated they are in this, and just how they take it out on like every song. I feel like that comes through despite the short songs. Like you said, they don't need to be long because they're just right to the point, and they get what they need to say in and out on each song. It just amused me as well. I feel like some of the things they said, like on Just Wanna, they were like, this song's called Fuck You, I just wanna fuck. And like, they're like, that's kind of like the
1, 2, 3, 4. Like,
yeah. That's like how the whole like MO of the album is, and kind of the overarching theme, and like,
with a very girly voice too, which makes it funny, because it's not like this growling voice. It's like like high,
yeah.
So it makes it even funnier in some ways.
Yeah, I just found it really kind of refreshing in a lot of ways. And we, as the decades go on in our in our journey, like production becomes more and more, things try and become more complex. Technology changes, but this kind of takes it back decades. And I think too, when it's this kind of low rent and DIY, it loses like a time period, because this could be like any time period. It could be in the 70s, it could be in the 80s. It definitely doesn't sound like quote unquote 90s. It's just to its essence. And so I think I really appreciated that. Good song choices too. I liked Fuck Your Fans a lot. Panic, Bitch Theme was really good. And there's just 27 minutes. It's hard to complain about that length too. So thumbs up for me. This is a good one.
Yeah, this is very, like I said before, and I kind of tip my hand a little bit. Like, you immediately get sort of the eclecticism and feminist viewpoint of like the Slits came to mind immediately. Mm-hmm. You mentioned the run. I mean, they cover the Runaways on this. They do a pretty good turn on Cherry Bomb, which I enjoyed. Definitely hardcore. the sort of the lyrics and the directness of it and the repetition, the get in, the get out, no pun intended, that's there. That's all here immediately, right? The Ramones, which we talked about, and then of course I laughed when it said like Bratmobile remastered. I'm like, remastered for what? The whole thing of this is basically the production is as quickly thrown together as you, which is not a bad thing, by the way, but it sounds like they're underwater. We haven't heard production like this since, Josh, remember that album we did? I think Sam was our guest, Matt wasn't here. Television Personalities, that I said like sounded like it was recorded in a tin can. Like that's the last time we heard production this level of just thrown together. And I like how Matt's like, I feel like sometimes the mix, I'm like, there's no consistency to this. Like, yeah, sometimes the lyrics are up front, sometimes the guitars are, I think because God only knows what recording stuff they were doing. There's no coherent thing. It was a refreshing change though, because so much stuff we've listened to, like a good example is like, and you guys are going to be shocked, but I actually really like the Tool album that you guys did last week. But boy, that production is crystalline clear. And probably the one limitation that is it was so clean. At times it was too clean, right? This is the exact opposite. And it's funny because I re-listened to this again after listening to the Tool album the first time. And it's like, boy, you want to talk about both ends of the production spectrum. This is really what it is. But yeah, I also to me, this is less about the musical choices and the instrument, because there's nothing about this that's designed about being virtuoso. This is about the attitude and like the zeitgeist of the movement. And there's something very interesting about Riot Grrrl, because I always think it's funny when a music is made and it's not for you, but you still enjoy it anyway. And so like you're able to still connect with it, even though that like the spirit of this music was designed to not be for you. And to some degree, I don't like to think of us as being toxic types of as we're talking about, but to some degree it's a reaction to like what all three of us are. You know what I think about it? Like, we're, members of the straight white male patriarchy, right? And it's kind of like you're listening to this and you're laughing. You're like, should I be more aware of what's being said here or not? Because I'm kind of grooving with this and feeling with it, but like how do I consume this?
John, is this our version of Rage Against the Machine, Paul Ryan? Like, is that what you're talking about?
Like I think we're a little bit more I think the fact that that I'm self-aware enough to know like how do I like enjoy this music without going like I am, friend of woman. You know what I mean? That's in there. It's kind of I read an article this week about the guy from Fun who produces like 9,000 albums. Jack Antonoff, yeah. Taylor Swift. And kind of like how sometimes it's like he sort of positions himself, whether purposely or not, as like, I understand women's emotions and stuff, and how that can be like vaguely creepy sometimes. And like, I don't want to come off as that guy, you know what I mean? But I do think we might have a little bit more credibility in the sense of like I think all three of us actually like and respect women in our day-to-day actions. So like we can kind of completely understand why this type of music was necessary and appreciate it. But do you get what I'm saying kind of? But also, at the end of the day, it's sort of like you only get to like own this out. Like if I said my favorite album of all time was Bratmobile, people would be like, well, that's a little too on the head, isn't it? You know what I mean? Like it's like it can't be a top 10 album for me because it's not supposed to be. I
mean, it also has a youthful energy to it. It's clearly like early 20s, late teens, early 20s type of mindset, energy, and just POV. So I appreciate it on that level as well.
So it makes the best music.
It's also funny because it's like I'd rather not want to like fuck you, but like at the same time, like I kind of do want to have sex. So now it's like this anger, you know what I mean? Of like, if we're going to do like, I want to do it and stuff like, you know what I mean? It comes through sort of that like dichotomy and stuff, which I found kind of funny. It's kind of like, well, if we're going to do it, like at least, let's recognize what it is.
Well, it's also like the cognitive dissonance of like being horny and like to people that are like no good for you or like not like, good guys. And
right.
so
Well,
I think
funny.
that's some of there as well.
because there's a DC reference to like the the park and ride and stuff, but
Yeah.
there's a fucking run reference there, just like there was with Liz Phair, right? You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, and that's another '93 album. So I feel like it was in the air, a little bit of like, and one of the through lines that we've talked about is, I think I always recognized this, and I'm not like giving myself like a gas up here or a subtle thing, but like I always was aware, even in the moment, that like the '90s had a lot of really great rock and music from women, and for whatever reason, like that was never a barrier for me. Like it was for a lot of guys I knew. Like they just liked their, and even some women I knew, they liked their rock to be male in some ways. It wasn't necessarily that they weren't the anti-female, it just was so embedded in them. But like I for whatever reason, I got the memo early on some of this stuff, so it wasn't as much of a surprise for me. But let's be real, some of the best stuff that's being produced in the '90s that we're covering so far like has like a feminine energy to it, but it's a more subversive, especially when you put it in the context of 1993 feminine energy. So yeah, I really like this album. This one's a thumbs up. Once again, I'll give the caveat, it's not for everybody. So in the same way that many albums we cover are not. But if you like the Ramones, if you like fast, aggressive music, if you like sort of irony, I feel like many of you would have already found music that was like this, but I think much like us, we're literate in this type of music, but I don't think any of us had gotten to Bratmobile specifically yet. So nice find here.
Once my nieces hit high school, I'm going to make them listen to this album, so they can just
Are you just going to give them like a primer tape, like Give the Slits and this and X-Ray Specs and Bikini Kill and
I have to
Liz
influence
Phair,
them somehow.
Exile?
Yep.
There you go.
Yeah,
So.
and definitely make the mix a cassette mix, Josh.
Yeah. For sure.
Yep. Josh is the best ally ever, is what they're going to say.
Yeah.
So
Well done.
Good.
All right.
Good stuff.